So I'm a little bit nervous about this because I am going to tell you the first of what I hope will be a series of stories about my grandfather. My grandfather was a storyteller himself, so I'm hoping to do him justice. His first performance, if you will. Frank was born on a February evening in 1918, on a night so cold they had to put him in the oven to keep him warm. And they must not have left him in there long enough, or left him in there too long, because he was always a little bit half-baked. Now, Frank had 2 older sisters and 2 younger brothers, and they all grew up in Stratford, Ontario, where they went to William Shakespeare Elementary School and went for walks along the Avon River, and were generally so surrounded by 16th century English literature that they all grew up to be teachers. In fact, it was so normal in Stratford to grow up to be a teacher that in order to do so, you went to normal school. So Frank went to normal school, but he never taught in any classroom because as soon as he was 16, Frank had been apprenticing in the train yards, in the shops at CN Railroad in Stratford with his 9 uncles. Now, Frank's wiry arms were good for reaching into engines, and his nimble fingers were good for untwisting bolts, twisting bolts back in. And his sharp mind was good for figuring out what was wrong with everything in the train yard. And so by the time he had finished normal school, Frank was a tutor and a teacher and a mechanic, and he figured he wouldn't have any trouble at all with the rest of his life. Then the war came, and some men in uniform came to Stratford looking for recruits. They came for the army, and they wanted strong men with good backs and good legs to carry packs for miles on end and sleep in ditches. And now Frank had heard stories from the First World War about sleeping in ditches, and that didn't sound like fun. And they came from the Air Force, and they wanted men with sharp eyes and good reflexes to teach to fly planes and drop bombs and shoot down enemy aircraft. And that sounded like more fun, but Frank knew that he had a school teacher's eyes. They were good for reading books and spotting troublemakers, but not much use for flying. And they came for the Navy, and they looked for good-humored men with strong stomachs who could take care of those ships. And they were all willing to offer a little extra money and a bit of a better position to anyone who could take care of the boilers. Well, said Frank, I take care of the steam engines. How different could that be? So Frank joined the Navy. That evening at supper, he told his brothers about joining the Navy. Join the Navy, said Frank. His brothers laughed until they cried. You can't join the Navy, Frank, they said. You can't swim. You're better off staying here and teaching the youngsters how to get through school. And he said, well, there'll be men on the ship that I can help to finish their high school education. If they want that, I can tutor them. His brother said, we'll believe it when they see it. And the next day at breakfast, he told his sisters, I've joined the Navy, said Frank. His sisters laughed until they cried. You can't swim, Frank, they said. You're better off staying here and being a school teacher. Frank said, well, I can take university courses while I'm gone. I'll be a better teacher when I get back. They will believe it when we see it, said his sisters. That day at lunch, he told his uncles. I'm joining the Navy, said Frank. His uncles laughed until they cried. You can't swim, Frank, they said. You're better off staying here being a mechanic. He said, well, I'll be doing the same thing I'll be doing here. I'll be better with the steam engines than any of you when I get home. His uncles said, we'll believe it when we see it. Besides, said Frank, completely logically, I won't have to swim. I'll be on the ship, and if it sinks, what good will swimming do to me? What am I going to do, swim back to shore? His uncle said, you couldn't swim back to shore if you were in the middle of a puddle. And with that, they picked him up, and they walked over to the Avon River, and they dumped him in. Now, Frank couldn't swim, but he could stand up, and his uncle said, I have to drop him into any part of the river deeper than 4 feet. So he stood up, he turned away from his uncles, and he clambered up the bank, and he walked in a straight line. Didn't even turn around for the jeers that his uncles were shouting at him over the river. And he got into the woods, and as soon as he couldn't hear his uncles anymore, and as soon as he was sure that no one could see him, he sat down on a stump to let his clothes dry, because he sure wasn't going home with wet clothes to answer his brothers' and his sisters' questions. And while he sat on that stump, he hatched a plan. The next day after breakfast, he went over to his best friend's house. Mitch, said Frank, I'm going to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. Now, this was 1940, And going over Niagara Falls in a barrel was a little bit outdated, really. I mean, no one had done it in the past 20 years, and it was almost as old-fashioned as walking across the falls in a tightrope. But Frank had a flair for the dramatic, and his brains were better than his balance, so he figured the barrel was the better plan. "I'm going over Niagara Falls in a barrel," said Frank. "No, you're not," said Mitchell. "Yes, I am, and I want you to help." "Huh, no way," said Mitch, imagining his mother's face if she found out. "I'll give you $1, said Frank. "All right." So, the first thing that we need is a barrel, said Frank. Luckily, there were a few lying around in the train yard, and that day he was able to steal one without his uncles even noticing. And that night, Frank climbed into the barrel, and Mitch closed up the cover, and it was tight squeeze, but he fit. "Next, we need to waterproof it," said Frank. So the next day, he climbed up to the roof where his brothers had been tarring. He stole a bucket of tar, and he snuck back down the ladder. And that night, he and Mitch painted 9 layers of tar on that barrel. "Now," said Frank, "we need to make sure it stands up straight." So they cut a hole in the top of the barrel so that he could breathe. And the next day, Frank went to his sister's rooms while they were asleep, and he stole the biggest, heaviest books he could find. And that night, they glued them one by one into the bottom of the barrel. The next morning, his family woke up to a note. "Gone over Niagara Falls in a barrel. Frank." So the family ran down to the train yard, and they got on the train for Niagara Falls. And Frank waited for them at the edge with Mitch until they got there, but he didn't wait much past when he could see them. And they were running towards him, and he had Mitch seal him into the barrel and shove him off into the current. And the water at Niagara Falls moves a lot faster than any human can run, so the family only ever saw the bit where the barrel went off and then disappeared. Frank told me this about 60 years later. And he said, "Well, that's all. It's nothing really that exciting. Only that I never heard a word against me going into the Navy ever again."
Nice.
I want to know whose father that was.
It's my mother.
Some elements of that story are true.